Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers.
On this episode of the podcast, we're discussing the comedy The Birdcage, and then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query. You can support the podcast on Patreon, where you can read the queries we critique, plus get lots of other bonus content, including monthly writing chats with us and the most adorable Story Chat Radio stickers. It's easy to find. Just go to patreon.com/storychatradio. Now, regular listeners, you know our podcast is now available on YouTube. Well, we are super excited to announce that you can now find us even easier there. Our YouTube handle now is at Story Chat Radio. And of course, you can find the link still on our social media and website.
All right, here come the spoilers. Armand Goldman owns a drag nightclub in Miami and is in a relationship with the club star Albert, who performs as a drag queen. Armand's son Val is home from college with an announcement. He is getting married to Barbara, whose father is a conservative senator. And oh yeah, she told her parents that Val's father is a cultural attaché for Greece and Val's mother is a housewife, and that their last name was Coleman, not Goldman. And now her parents are on the way to visit Val's. Val begs his father to go along with the charade, and after some deliberation, he concedes. They both set to work remodeling their apartment. Albert is offended at Armand and Val asking him to be absent, and Armand calms him down and reaffirms their devotion by giving him partnership of the nightclub. Out of ideas, they ask Val's birth mother, Catherine, to join them. Unfortunately, Catherine gets stuck in traffic the night the Keeleys arrive. Unexpectedly, Albert dresses as a woman and takes her place, to the horror of Armand and Val, but it works and the senator is delighted with Mrs. Coleman, much to Louise's indignation. However, through a series of awkward events, the Keeleys start to suspect that the Colemans are hiding something. Inevitably, the Keeleys find out about the lies and decide to leave immediately, but they discover a massive news cruise and duck back in, trapped. Albert comes up with a plan. He dresses the Keeleys in drag and gets them out through the nightclub without being spotted. Val and Barbara get married in an interfaith ceremony presided over by both a rabbi and priest, attended by Kevin and Louise, Catherine, and Armand and Albert. And so it's sort of a happy ending. Jenny, what do you think about the movie?
Okay, so like a lot of our 90s movies, I watched this when it came out. And I don't think I really got the heavy dose of satire intended in the plot. Like, I picked up on the cultural commentary, but I expected when I rewatched it to find the characters a lot more problematic than they actually are. I mean, yes, the depictions are super stereotypical for sure. But there's a lot here that's positive. Like, we've got this, loving gay relationship. We've got, that they are both successful in their business. They've raised a happy and well-adjusted son for the most part. We can get more into my feelings about Val later. Yeah. And so really, though, I think the movie really wants us all to be more like Albert, who I think presumably could be seen as one of the worst stereotypes in the movie. But like to just be unapologetically who we are and kind of build our lives around that. And yes, oh my God, shame on Val for asking this of them.
Seriously.
And Barbara for lying about it to begin with. And then Armand for trying to change or hide Albert. Yeah, like all of that was really, really painful to watch. Very cringy.
It was.
But the other part of that is that I think a lot of these issues are still around today. I mean, like we want to think that society has moved on, but it really hasn't. And if maybe we once did think it had moved on, the last few years have showed us that it has not. But yeah, I think what really makes this movie worth a rewatch is just flawless performances by an amazing cast. Robin Williams and Nathan Lane are both incredible. And honestly, like, I love Diane Wieston, like, and everything I've ever seen her in. So what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved this movie from when I was a kid. I used to watch it constantly. It was always on TV, and I would just constantly watch it. And yeah, like, some things didn't age well. They're a little too stereotypical, but most of it really does age well, and I was very surprised. I was very worried going into this. I think it touches on a lot of serious issues while still making it a fun comedy. But yeah, Val's privilege and horribleness is on full display.
Yeah, he's the worst.
The worst. But what I think it actually kind of shows is that they really gave him a very safe home growing up.
Yeah.
To the point where he doesn't understand the horribleness of what he's asking.
Maybe too safe. That's what I'm hearing. It was too safe.
I feel like it was too safe. Like, he was so coddled, he can ask them anything and it assumes it's okay, and it really isn't. But my biggest problem is that Barbara is 18, Val is 20, and at the beginning she tells her parents that she's been having sex with him for a year.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like they didn't do the math there.
Yeah.
I'm hoping. I don't know. And also, I hate that they get married in the end and everything is, like, fine.
Yes.
Because after all the terrible shit the Keeleys put them through, they are awful people.
I like to think they bonded over how awful their kids are.
Maybe. Well, I mean, I feel like we're kind of supposed to think that they've changed a little bit.
Totally, but they haven't.
No.
People don't change that fast.
I don't know. I feel like I'm too much of a curmudgeon to believe in.
You are. That's why I love you.
I know. But yeah, Robin Williams is amazing. And I do think it would need to be done pretty differently nowadays.
Yeah.
But I feel like you can really tell how much they respect and love the material, and like there's an earnestness to it that I was really happy to see. They really tried to honor these issues while making it palatable and funny for a 90s audience.
Yeah.
So, I'm glad I could still love it. Anyway, Jenny, what's something this movie does well that writers can use in their own work?
Really obnoxious adult kids. No, I'm just kidding.
Yep.
I mean, it does do that well. It does do that well.
It does.
But, so one of the things that really struck me in this story is that each character really has their own motivation, and it's really clear throughout the story. And it made me think about GMC, which, for our listeners, is short for Goal, Motivation, Conflict. So I think this is a great film for writers to watch with that in mind. The cast is really interesting because it does have so many amazing actors, and they all do a really great job of portraying their motivations throughout the whole film. And the best part of that is that because you get to see that through the whole movie, you really get to see how those different goals and motivations cause so much of the conflict. It's not only between Val's family and Barbara's family. We see those conflicts and motivation within the families as well. So when you have all that set out from the beginning and carried through the whole story, it gives you, the author, a lot of opportunity for character development and to have some serious tension, even in a comedy. So like in this movie, the tension looks like an almost visceral uncomfortability because you just know the lie is going to come to light at some point. You just don't know how or when exactly. And so, about GMC, I just want to note that in writing, you can use this GMC information with pretty much any plotting method or structure because it's related to, but not the same as plot, structure, or pacing.
It like informs on those.
Right.
All right. So let's start with the GMC overview, and then we'll break it down and get into more specifics. So the quick overview basically looks like this. Goal: what is it that the character wants? Motivation: why do they want it? And conflict: what is stopping them from getting it? Every character needs a GMC because honestly, that's kind of the basics of humanity and who we are. We all want something. We all have our reasons for wanting it. It can range from wanting food because we're hungry to being desperate for love because we spent so much of our time alone as a child, and we just want somebody to hold us. Those kinds of things. The more you dig into this, the more you'll really get to know your characters, though. So one of my biggest pieces of advice is to really always flesh this out. Even if it doesn't make it onto the page, it will inform on how your characters are going to act in any given situation. It will show you what they prioritize, what they're willing to ignore, what will frustrate them, and what they'll go too far for. So if you know the GMC of all your characters, not just your main character, then the plot's going to really unfold in a natural way, because you will understand how they would act and what they would do and why they would do it. It's basically the basis of all your characters. You've thrown them into a plot full of tension and conflict, but how they react, what they care about, and what they want at the end of the book all support that tension and plot. So without those things, we're not going to care about the story, because we won't understand how the characters kind of tie into it. They will just feel like placed in there instead of integral to it.
And I'm sure you see this too. I feel like it's something I see pretty often in the manuscripts that I edit or query letters or pitches. It's just this kind of like, it seems like you've got a great character. It seems like you've got a great plot, but it's not always clear how those connect.
Exactly.
So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah. This is the connection between the two.
Okay. So a goal seems fairly self-explanatory, but there's actually a lot here we can dig into. So on the surface, the goal is, what does the main character need to accomplish their mission? Do they need to reach a destination, find an object, rescue a person, have a difficult conversation? In essence, like Carly said, it's what does the character want? This goal needs to be related to the main premise of the story. So in this movie, the main character is really Armand. And what Armand wants is to make a good impression on Val's future in-laws so that they won't object to Barbara marrying him. But that goal is not easy to accomplish. And it conflicts with some of his other goals, like being a good partner to Albert and living his life in a way that he and his partner have built together. So when you're looking at your character's goals, consider how they might have other goals that compete. The other thing to consider is what I touched on before, that every character really needs their own goals. So Albert's goals are similar to Armand's, but he also has this goal of not wanting to be excluded. The senator wants his child to be able to marry the person she loves, but his competing goals have to do with his public persona and his political reputation.
I mean, does he want his daughter to be able to marry who she loves?
I mean, as long as it doesn't hurt his reputation.
Yeah. Debatable.
Yeah, right. Louise has these same goals as him, but then also goals based on her expectations around her role as a wife. So we get to see some of those conservative values coming in there. So when you get all of these characters together and they each have goals that compete within themselves and then with the other characters as well, it really gives you this rich starting place where there's already a lot of inherent conflict that comes just from the sense of having to balance all of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. All right, so next we've got the motivation. This is very similar to the emotional wound. They tie in together a lot. And we talked about that on a previous episode. I believe it was the Shang-Chi and the 10 Rings episode.
You're so good at remembering those. I always forget what we've already talked about.
Well, I was like, I feel like we talked about it. I had to look it up, to be clear. But I did have a vague remembrance. I was like, didn't we talk about emotional wounds? Maybe. Anyway, so listen to that episode 2 if you haven't already. I'm not going to get into emotional wounds too much here. So let's go back to motivation. So motivation for a character is basically the reason that they want their goal. What is the void that they are trying to fill? What happened to your characters that makes them want to achieve their goal? Often this ties into their emotional wound and some big event from their past. So again, go listen to that episode. But let's look at Armand first. He has spent his whole life making things good for Val. He wants him to have a safe place and to not get hurt. We see this when Val basically confronts him about what he told him as a child, which was to lie about who his parents were or what his parents did. Armand responds with, "You were a kid. I didn't want you to get hurt." And Val, very selfishly, I might add, responds that he can still get hurt even as an adult. So this is super punching Armand right in the gut, right in his motivations, his emotional wounds, and all of that.
I'm realizing as you're saying this, I'm like rolling my eyes and getting all like angry faced, and our listeners can't even see me doing that.
I know. I can feel it. I feel like they can feel
the vibes
the
are coming
the
through.
Vibe. God, Val, it's so unacceptable.
So,
the worst.
So the worst.
Of course you can still get hurt. His father can get hurt too.
No, he doesn't have feelings. He's just a parent.
Anyway, Armand has clearly faced a ton of hatred from others. He's been hurt in the past for just being himself. You can really see that in his overprotectiveness of Val. All he wants is to protect his child. Protecting Val clearly comes from a place of pain and of his own hurt. And this motivation manifests in a couple different ways. In wanting to protect Val, obviously, but also in wanting to be himself. Like, he doesn't want to hide. He made this life for himself where he doesn't have to hide.
Yeah.
And also struggling to put Albert into the same position of pain that Armand has been feeling a lot in the past. He's hurting Albert when he does what Val wants. So he tries to protect Val but is hurting Albert. It's not fair, and his motivation is pulling him to different competing goals, like Jenny was talking about. It's all so painful, basically, because of this motivation. Armand wouldn't bother hiding his true self if he hadn't felt that pain. He wouldn't be so torn up about doing it to Albert if he hadn't felt that pain. Not only does the motivation explain why a character wants a goal, it also creates the heartache that we feel as the characters struggle to achieve that goal. Which leads perfectly into conflict, Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the real crux of GMC. It's not the goal or the conflict, only because I feel like writers pretty much know that they have to have that.
Yep.
It's how the pieces all tie together. And to me, the piece that really ties it all together is that motivation. So if the goal is the what and the motivation is the why, then the conflict could be characterized as the but. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it would be better to call it the problem.
No, I like but with two T's.
So there's a thing that your character wants. They have a good reason for it, but something is stopping them. So that's an obstacle, and that obstacle is standing in the way of what they want. That gap between where the character is and what they want is where all the conflict is at in that gap. And they're going to have to take some kind of action in order to bridge that gap. But what really makes that unique in each story is the character's motivation, because that's what makes it personal, those competing motivations and competing goals. So Val's goal is to marry Barbara. He wants to because he is the worst, and she is also the worst, so they'll make a great couple. Uh-huh. And I guess he loves her or something.
Oh, we haven't even gotten to when Barbara then chooses her family, because they are like, no, come with us. And she's like, okay, I guess I won't marry this guy.
God. The worst.
The worst.
Just
That's
the
not
worst.
okay.
I know.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So,
I'm
what
so
was I talking
angry.
about that? Oh, I was talking about them being the worst. He sees the obstacle as his father being a gay Jewish drag club owner, and not that his fiance thought it would be a good idea to lie to her parents about his family. Mm-hmm. So the conflict is created by their need to get past her parents believing a lie about his family so that they can get married. We don't really get into his goals as much as some of the other characters, but I think it seems like he really wants to protect Barbara in the same way that Armand wants to protect him, and really knows how important her father's reputation is to their family. So I guess they assumed like they'd never see each other
Yeah,
again
I don't
after this, or
understand that.
like they would be married, so it wouldn't matter anymore.
It'd be too late to do anything about it,
I
I
don't know.
guess. I
I don't
don't know.
know. I hate Val. That's the point. I
Yeah,
hate him.
I hate him.
Anyway, so think about where your character is, what they want, what's stopping them from getting it. What action will they take to try to get around the obstacle? And how does their underlying motivation impact the actions that they choose and even what they see as acceptable options?
Yeah.
So, like that underlying motivation, I think, part of us seeing Val and Barbara as being the worst is that, you know, 20 something years later, God's probably close to 30 years later. I don't know when this movie actually came out, but close to 30 years later, we're looking at this movie and going like, this is not okay, because a lot of that dynamics of like what's considered to be an adult versus a child, and how people are supposed to see their parents as adults, and a lot of those kinds of things have changed in the last 30 years. So when we look at it from a modern, and I say that, but like even at the time I was like, oh my God, you're the worst.
Yeah.
I was like a teenager when it
I
came
was super
out,
annoyed
so.
with him then. But
Anyway,
I feel like we didn't have the context of quite how horrible it was to ask this of his parents
yes,
to the degree that we have now,
yes,
just because we were much younger. But I really like that bit about what they see as acceptable options, because
Yes.
I think that is really important, and how I think I mentioned like what your character is willing to ignore and where
Yeah.
they're gonna put their focus.
yeah,
Because
and where they'll go too far. You said that as well.
Yes,
Like, what
they
are they
go too
willing to
far.
go too far for? And I like that too.
Yeah, because I think that's kind of the crux of a lot of this is we will, as humans, put up with a lot of bad stuff, and we will continue to do so as we ignore certain things or deal with it or just let certain things go because they're not worth it or because our priorities lie elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I think GMC is really about fleshing that out for your character. Like, Val is really willing to think that this is acceptable. And is it because of his extreme love for Barbara or because he had such a sheltered childhood? It's unclear. But,
I think it's just because he's the worst.
or because he's just the worst. But like, as you understand that about your characters, as if you were writing someone like Val, you're going to really see like, he's willing to ignore this awful thing because he thinks it's not going to continue to be a problem.
I can't
Because
wait till he has kids.
I know, because his goal supersedes this awful thing. Anyway.
Yeah.
All right. So, it's important to note that GMC can be used at a scene level and at a story level. So, like we were saying earlier, GMC will help you make sure your characters are reacting naturally. And this means really on every level. They'll react to the larger plot challenges based on their GMC. Like Armand follows through and lies for Val. He also eventually stands his ground on Albert being part of the family because he can't lose him.
Yeah.
These moments are extremely story level. But each scene also needs to be informed by a GMC. So having a GMC on a scene level looks more like, what are your characters' temporary scene goals that often tie into their larger story goals? Why do they need to achieve that in this scene? And what is the scene conflict that is getting in their way? So let's take a smaller scene from this movie. Armand goes to collect Val's birth mother, Catherine, to get her to help them with the dinner. His goal is to convince her to come to the dinner. The motivation is that if she is there, Albert will look more masculine for the Keeleys, which is completely bonkers, but it's a comedy. And the conflict is Albert's jealousy and the fact that he hasn't seen Val's birth mother in 20 years. The GMC here ties into the overall plot, but we're also dealing with scene level GMC. Albert's jealousy has been popping up from the beginning of the movie. It ties into kind of what Jenny was saying earlier. He feels like a guest, like an outsider. And that bubbles up whenever Armand doesn't include him in something. And while that informs on the major plot by having Albert show up at the dinner, it also informs in small ways by causing fights between Albert and Armand. So conflicting character GMCs where you understand why each character is doing what they're doing, even if it hurts the other character, really creates the best tension.
Yeah. And so through most of this, we've been talking about the external GMC, but it can be used on internal arcs as well. Mm-hmm. So your characters will have internal obstacles and goals in addition to the external ones. And so this is for every story, whether it's plot-based or plot-driven or character-driven. You're going to have internal and external goals and obstacles. So everything we've been talking about here can be applied at that internal level as well. In the same way that each scene will build on the external conflict, it also needs to build on the internal conflict. You'll have an overall internal goal for the story, and then that'll be broken into smaller internal goals for each scene. So just ask yourself, what are those goals? Why are they important to the character? What's stopping them from accomplishing those goals? And how does that tie into the choices they have to make in the external plot? So yeah, GMC really is one of my favorite tools because it's a pretty simple concept, but it applies to storytelling on so many levels.
It really does. It's often the answer to a lot of problems that authors come up against.
Yeah, it really is.
Digging into that deeply.
Yeah, so I think it's worth mentioning too that this is based on a book named GMC, Goal Motivation Conflict, and the author is Deborah Dixon. So definitely worth reading that and really digging into all of those details and getting lots of examples. You know, I love a craft book.
I know, you're so good at that.
Okay, so that brings us to our query for this month, which is a YA fantasy. Carly, what are your thoughts on this query?
This query is pretty solid on the stakes and conflict, but I'm not seeing what the personal non-saving the world stakes are. She wants to save her sister, which is also very personal, but mostly she wants to stop the big bad. But what does the big bad want, and why do they want it? Hey, GMC, it's in queries too. Problem is that when you focus on such big things, we don't really get to see what is personal and special about your story. So it's not going to seem as unique as it could because we won't get to know why the story is different and deeper when the stakes are basically save the world or do this thing or the world is in turmoil. So basically I want you to show us the personal non-huge stakes. Not just why your character is involved, but why it has to be this character. Like, why is her sister taken? Why does she need to save her? What's special here? I just kind of want you to dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think, I agree with all of that. And I think to put it in the context of GMC, since you brought that up, what's missing here is kind of that motivation. So we don't really know, like, why does she have to be the one to do this? What is her personal motivation? So really think about, like, what is her emotional wound? What is her personal motivation? All of that stuff. And yeah, I agree. I think this story sounds so good. And the query starts out really strong. Like the beginning of it is really strong, but then I feel like it kind of starts to meander as it goes on. And so just to add to what Carly was saying, make sure your sentences flow logically from one thought to the next. So right now it sort of jumps around. So you mentioned at the beginning that her monsters have her sister, and then you tell us about the monster, and then you go back and tell us again that he has her sister. And then the next paragraph does something similar with she has to find the sword, and then she has to use the sword, but then you tell us how she has to find the sword again. So the flow would make more sense if you rearrange some to be like, she has to find the sword, this is what she has to do to get the sword, and then this is what she has to do after she gets the sword. Would just sort of be a more logical flow and make the flow of the whole query work a little better.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end. Next month, we will be watching the action comedy Free Guy, as was chosen by our patrons on Patreon. We will also have another query or blurb critique, so if you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com. You can also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can support the show and get extra content at patreon.com/storychatradio. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at storychatradio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.